She seduced Rome's greatest generals and commanded an empire. But the Cleopatra you know is likely a lie crafted by the men who defeated her. Let's strip away centuries of propaganda to reveal the brilliant, ruthless tactician behind the legend of the last pharaoh. Have you ever stopped to think about how conversations from thousands of years ago still reverberate today, effectively building the foundation of our modern world? Or maybe you've pondered the bizarre reality behind historical figures whose reputations are so massive they feel more like legends than actual people. Consider this. Mernith, the very first female ruler of Egypt, held the throne a staggering 3,000 years before Cleopatra ever came into the picture. The enigmas of ancient authority and the rulers, whose names we still recite, really force you to reconsider the definition of the past. We start this story not with the Queen of the Nile herself, but with the massive, almost unreasonable ambition of a man who changed Egypt's future forever without initially stepping foot there: Alexander the Great. Picture a young king of Macedon moving his armies across the known map like a storm, an unstoppable force of nature. He wasn't merely winning battles, he was essentially redrawing the world order with his sword. When he finally focused on Egypt in 332 BCE, his arrival didn't look like a violent invasion. Instead, it felt like a rescue mission from the Persians, who, let's be honest, were not exactly winning the hearts and minds of the locals in the Nile Delta. The Egyptian people, tired of foreign oppression, mostly embraced him, likely hoping he would be a lighter burden to bear. Alexander, always planning ahead, recognized the incredible value Egypt offered, seeing it as a gateway to Africa, a fertile agricultural hub, and a breadbasket for his growing territory. He founded the spectacular city of Alexandria on the Mediterranean shore, intended to be a center for commerce and knowledge, and most importantly, the future capital of his Egyptian holdings. However, there is a major plot twist in this saga. For all his energy and brilliance, Alexander had one massive blind spot. He never named a successor. It's comparable to hosting the biggest party of the year and then vanishing without telling anyone who owns the house. This failure to plan plunged his massive empire into total anarchy as his generals fought for control after his sudden death in 323 BCE. This is where Ptolemy Isoter enters the stage. He was one of Alexander's most reliable generals, a veteran who had traveled from the sands of Persia to the landscapes of India. He was a survivor and a realist, with a bit of opportunistic flair, as all great commanders tend to be. While his peers were busy fighting chaotic battles over random territories, Ptolemy made a brilliant, calculated play. He secured Egypt. Imagine someone quietly taking the best slice of cake while everyone else is arguing. He didn't just grab it. He slowly and deliberately solidified his grip, starting as a governor for Alexander's supposed successors. But as the dust settled from the successor wars, it became obvious that the empire was never going to be reunited. Reading the writing on the wall, Ptolemy proclaimed himself king of Egypt in 305 BCE, officially launching the Ptolemaic dynasty. We aren't talking about a small tribal kingdom here. This was a Hellenistic superpower that mixed Greek military might and administration with the immense wealth and traditions of Egypt. It was a unique cultural mashup, almost like throwing a Greek celebration inside an ancient pharaonic temple. Although they were Greek by blood, the Ptolemaic family adopted plenty of local habits, including the controversial custom of siblings marrying to maintain the purity of the royal bloodline. While this was normal for pharaohs, it created a confusing family tree packed with betrayal, power grabs, and sibling rivalries that would make modern reality shows look boring. Just imagine those family gatherings. Oh, Ptolemy the 12th, look who it is still plotting to steal the crown. The Ptolemies embraced these traditions, which were rooted in Egyptian beliefs about divine kingship, to appear legitimate to their subjects, even while they stayed culturally Greek. Scholars still debate whether this was done out of religious respect, or just as a cold strategy to keep power concentrated and stop outsiders from marrying into the family. Regardless, it definitely created some tense holiday dinners. This family would hold the throne for almost 300 years, which is an incredibly long run for a dynasty founded by a foreign general. They amassed huge fortunes, mostly due to Egypt's agricultural output and its prime location for trade between the East and West. Under their watch, Alexandria grew into a world-class metropolis, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria and the Lighthouse of Pharaoh, a wonder of the ancient world. It was a place of unmatched architectural and intellectual splendor, proving the Ptolemaic vision was a success. However, by the time we reached the later rulers, the dynasty was starting to crumble. The initial energy and brilliance had faded, replaced by corruption, infighting, and a dangerous reliance on Rome, the emerging power in the West. The once great kingdom was turning into a client state, slowly getting pulled into the Roman orbit like a ship caught in a riptide. The scene was set, and the foundation laid for the final act of this long drama, starring a queen who would become immortal. With that complex lineage and the looming shadow of Rome established, let's zoom in on the specific era when the dynasty, while still rich, was definitely past its peak. Cleopatra, the seventh, Philopator was born into this world of fading grandeur and family treachery, likely around late 69 BCE. The fact that we don't have her exact birth date is frustrating, but it allows us to picture a dramatic entrance. Her father was Ptolemy, the 12th, audacious, known by the less-than-flattering nicknames the flute player or the bastard. Historians continue to debate if these names were jabs at his musical hobbies or insults regarding his right to rule. Either way, he wasn't exactly viewed as a powerhouse monarch. Ptolemy, the 12th, was a weak leader who depended heavily on Rome, even paying to get his throne back, which turned Egypt into a financial resource for the Romans rather than a sovereign power. Cleopatra's youth was likely spent in the luxurious but perilous Alexandria palace. Imagine growing up where your nearest relatives are also your deadliest threats. Every whispered chat or shadow could hide a scheme. It was like a survival game with real stakes and real crowns. She wasn't an only child. She had to deal with an older sister, Berenice IV, who briefly stole the throne, along with younger sisters Arsinoe IV and Cleopatra Tryphena, plus two younger brothers both named Ptolemy. Yes, two brothers with the same name, just to keep things confusing. With so many siblings claiming the throne, tension was guaranteed. It almost makes a quiet, normal life sound appealing, doesn't it? Despite the chaos, Cleopatra received a top-tier education. While her ancestors stuck to Greek and ignored the local tongue, Cleopatra mastered several languages, reportedly speaking Egyptian, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, and the languages of the Medes and Parthians. Think about the intelligence required for that. This skill with languages wasn't just a hobby, it was a political weapon. It meant she could speak directly to her people, foreign leaders, and the diverse groups in her empire. It separated her from her ancestors, who usually ruled through translators. Experts still wonder if learning Egyptian was a sign of cultural respect or just a smart way to gain popularity. It was likely a mix of strategy and genuine interest. Her curiosity went beyond language. She studied astronomy, literature, philosophy, and mathematics. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was a brilliant, calculating intellectual. Her upbringing was also defined by the city of Alexandria, a true hub of culture and learning. The Library of Alexandria might have been past its absolute peak, but it remained an unmatched treasure trove of human wisdom. Inside the Mausoleum, essentially a prototype for the modern research institute, the halls buzzed with the energy of scholars and philosophers. In this environment, Cleopatra immersed herself in the most advanced scientific theories, literary masterpieces, and intellectual debates the Hellenistic world had to offer. The city itself was a vibrant, global crossroads where diverse cultures met and occasionally collided. Yet, this intellectually rich atmosphere also served as a constant warning of Egypt's fragility. The streets were filled with Roman merchants and officials, their presence a subtle but undeniable sign of the Republic's expanding reach. Throughout her youth, The background noise was always filled with rumors of Roman power and the sight of their legions passing through. It is easy to picture Cleopatra simply appearing on the historical stage as a confident, seductive monarch, but her childhood was actually defined by intense study and high-stakes political lessons. She realized early on that the throne wasn't a guaranteed right. It was a prize that had to be seized, defended, and, if lost, fought for. Watching her father, Ptolemy, the 12th, struggle to keep his position offered a brutal tutorial in global diplomacy. His frantic journeys to bribe and plead with Rome for support showed her that alliances were shaky and power could vanish in an instant. Seeing Egypt rely so heavily on the moods of a distant superpower toughened her resolve and sharpened her political mind. She wasn't merely studying history, she was living it, preparing for a future where she would have to navigate a world dominated by Rome. Even as a child, the future queen was mastering the merciless art of survival. So picture a young woman, not yet 20, educated in ancient wisdom and hardened by harsh realities, suddenly pushed onto the dangerous stage of power. In 51 BCE, after a lifetime of appeasing Rome to keep his shaky crown, Ptolemy, the 12th, passed away, leaving behind a kingdom drowning in debt and a family torn apart by ambition. His will, a desperate attempt to ensure stability, declared that his eldest daughter, Cleopatra, should rule jointly with her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy the 13th. You heard that correctly, a 10-year-old. This joint rule wasn't a partnership, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The goal was to preserve the dynasty, but instead it created a power vacuum that rival factions immediately raced to fill. At 18 or 19, Cleopatra was certainly not your average teenage ruler. She was imposing, brilliant, and unlike her predecessors, she grasped the immense value of public perception. She immediately started asserting her authority, making decisions that bypassed the established Greek officials who were used to pulling the strings from the shadows. This was more than a simple disagreement. It was a war over who really ran Egypt. The powerful advisors and eunuchs, especially Pothinus, the boy king's regent, and Achilles, the army commander, viewed Cleopatra as a direct threat to their influence. They wanted a malleable child they could control, not a sharp, ambitious queen with her own agenda. Historians still debate whether Pothinus truly believed he was acting in Egypt's best interest or if he was simply power-hungry. Given the cutthroat nature of Ptolemaic politics, it was likely a mix of both. One of Cleopatra's early moves that really antagonized the court was minting coins featuring only her face, a bold statement of her intent to govern alone. While this might seem like a small detail today, in the ancient world, currency was a primary tool for propaganda. It was a quiet but unmistakable signal that she refused to be a puppet. She also began signing official documents simply as Cleopatra, dropping the shared Ptolemy title expected of co-rulers, another calculated assertion of her individual sovereignty. These acts were radical breaks from tradition and open challenges to the established order. The friction between Cleopatra and the faction ruling through Ptolemy the 13th escalated quickly. It wasn't long before the situation exploded. By 49 BCE, just 2 years into her reign, the tension turned into open conflict. Pothinus and Achilles, sensing Cleopatra's growing power and popularity, staged a coup. They systematically stripped her of authority and eventually forced her to flee Alexandria. Think about that shift. One day you are the queen, the next you are running for your life, sneaking out of the palace, perhaps under the cover of darkness with only a few loyalists. It's the kind of dramatic escape you'd see in a thriller movie. She wasn't just exiled, she was branded an enemy of the state. But Cleopatra didn't just vanish into the desert. She headed straight for Roman Syria, proving she knew exactly where the real power in the region lay. She didn't leave quietly, she went with a strategy. Her objective was clear: raise an army, find allies, and take back her throne. She understood that appealing to Roman authorities was her best bet. It was a desperate gamble, but Cleopatra was never one to back down from a fight. You have to admire that level of grit, even if it led to some difficult situations. Her younger sister, Arsinoe IV, also fled the capital around this time, though it remains unclear if she was allied with Cleopatra or just escaping the chaos. Historians are still trying to piece that part of the story together. While Cleopatra was busy gathering her forces on the eastern border, the faction controlling her brother solidified their grip on Alexandria. They were running the show, purging Cleopatra's supporters and digging in. But this fragile peace was about to be shattered by an external force, a power so immense it would reshape the entire Mediterranean: Rome. Specifically, it was the arrival of Pompey the Great, the celebrated Roman general who was fleeing his arch-rival Julius Caesar after a crushing defeat. Pompey sailed to Egypt expecting sanctuary from a friendly client kingdom. He was tragically mistaken. The stage was now set for a massive collision. Cleopatra was poised to invade from the east with her new army. Her brother's faction sat comfortably in Alexandria. And then, like a plot twist in a drama, Julius Caesar, the most powerful man of the age, was arriving hot on Pompey's heels. The Ptolemaic court, making a catastrophically short-sighted choice, decided to be pragmatic. They assassinated Pompey, hoping to curry favor with the victorious Caesar. They presented the general's severed head to Caesar as a gruesome welcome gift. They didn't realize that Caesar, despite his ruthlessness, valued tradition and former alliances. Instead of impressing him, the act utterly appalled him. With Caesar now on Egyptian soil, the fate of Cleopatra, her brother, and the entire kingdom hung in the balance. The game had truly begun. Imagine the tension. Cleopatra is on the frontier raising an army to fight her way back. Meanwhile, in the treacherous city of Alexandria, her brother, or rather the ruthless men controlling him, felt smug about having expelled the troublesome queen. But their confidence was about to be shattered. As we touched on earlier, Pompey the Great arrived seeking refuge, only to be executed on the orders of the Egyptian court. They believed this betrayal would win them favor with Caesar, but instead, it triggered a sequence of events worthy of a blockbuster drama. The entire Mediterranean region was a pressure cooker of political tension, and Egypt was about to turn up the heat. Julius Caesar landed in Alexandria shortly after, intending to apprehend his rival. Instead of finding Pompey, he was presented with a severed head on a platter, a bold and gruesome offering from the court of Ptolemy the 13th. Although Caesar was a pragmatic man, he valued Roman tradition, and he was reportedly horrified by the sight. It wasn't just the gore that upset him. It was the breach of hospitality and the profound disrespect shown to a former Roman consul, regardless of their recent enmity. Pothinus and Achilles had made a massive strategic error that would soon blow up in their faces. Rather than being grateful, Caesar was deeply insulted. He had arrived with a relatively small force, numbering perhaps only a few thousand soldiers, with two goals: to resolve the Egyptian civil war and to collect the massive debts the Ptolemies owed to Rome. Caesar was not a man who forgot about money owed. Cleopatra, always the sharp tactician, realized that Caesar's arrival changed the entire playing field. She knew that her own army wasn't enough to retake the throne. She required the weight of Caesar's support. The problem was getting past her brother's security forces in Alexandria to speak with him. This necessity birthed one of history's most legendary tales, a story so audacious it sounds like fiction. The famous narrative, passed down by writers like Plutarch, claims she had herself smuggled into the palace, potentially hidden inside a bedsack or a rolled-up carpet. Picture the moment. The most powerful general in Rome is waiting for a formal meeting, and instead, a young, determined queen unravels herself at his feet. Historians continue to debate whether the carpet detail is a literal fact or a dramatic flourish added later to emphasize her cleverness. Regardless of the specific method, the core fact holds true. She successfully bypassed her enemies to gain a private audience with Caesar, winning him over with her wit and determination. It is amusing to imagine a Roman soldier unknowingly carrying a heavy, and likely perfumed, bundle containing a monarch. This clandestine meeting in late 48 BCE shifted the tide of history. Unlike her brother's clumsy political moves, Cleopatra appealed to Caesar's logic and his need for a stable Egyptian government aligned with Rome. She argued her case brilliantly, speaking to him in Greek, a language he respected, and positioning herself as the legitimate heir who had been wrongfully removed by power-hungry advisors. Her intellect and charm clearly left a mark. Caesar, always quick to spot an advantage, recognized that Cleopatra was far more capable than her younger, easily manipulated brother. He viewed her not only as a queen, but as a partner who could guarantee that Egypt's vast resources and wealth remained accessible to him and to Rome. The immediate result of their secret alliance was a sudden change in Caesar's official stance. He announced that the will of Ptolemy, the 13th, must be honored, meaning Cleopatra and Ptolemy, the 13th, were to rule as joint monarchs. This decision, which appeared fair on the surface, enraged Pothinus and Achilles, who had bet everything on Caesar supporting them. They viewed Cleopatra's new connection to Caesar as a direct threat to their own survival. The tension exploded into open combat, merging the Egyptian civil war with a conflict against the Roman legions. This struggle, termed the Alexandrian War, became unexpectedly vicious. Caesar found himself and his small contingent trapped within the palace quarter, besieged by the significantly larger army fighting for Ptolemy, the 13th. It was an incredibly risky scenario, highlighting Caesar's boldness, as he had walked into a hostile city with barely enough men to defend himself. Tragically, during the siege, the great library of Alexandria caught fire. While the extent of the destruction is still debated by scholars, it is generally accepted that a massive number of priceless scrolls and texts were incinerated, dealing a devastating blow to human knowledge. Whether the fire was an accident of war or intentional, the loss of the library stands as a monumental cultural disaster. Throughout the violence and chaos, Cleopatra stayed within the palace walls with Caesar, facing the same perils and likely offering her advice. Her loyalty during this life-or-death struggle would have strengthened their bond significantly. The risks were enormous. If Caesar was defeated, her chance of reclaiming the throne would vanish with him. Her survival, her crown, and Egypt's future depended entirely on whether this Roman general could survive the siege. So the situation in the Alexandrian War saw Julius Caesar, Rome's leading figure, effectively cornered in the royal district, fighting alongside Cleopatra against the overwhelming numbers of her brother's forces. It was a perilous standoff that lasted for months, pushing Caesar's military genius and Cleopatra's patience to their limits. This was no minor skirmish. It was a desperate fight for survival where the destiny of Egypt and the future of the Roman Republic hung in the balance. One can only imagine the stress, the clash of weapons reverberating through the palace, and the constant fear of the defenses breaking. It was hardly the relaxing victory lap Caesar might have expected after his long pursuit of Pompey. The Egyptian army, commanded by Achilles and the cunning Pothinus, held the upper hand in manpower and knowledge of the city. They controlled the streets and the waterways, effectively blockading Caesar. However, Caesar was a master of adaptation. He fortified his sector, launched surprise attacks, and even seized the Pharaoh's lighthouse to maintain control over the harbor, which cut off the Egyptian navy. Throughout this ordeal, Cleopatra was far more than a passive observer. She acted as a political advisor and a living symbol of the true Ptolemaic lineage, helping to sway Egyptians who remained loyal to the traditional royal line. While experts debate the specifics of her tactical contributions, she certainly wasn't sitting around idly. She would have supplied critical information about the local geography, the various political factions, and the vulnerabilities of her brother's commanders. The war took another dramatic turn involving Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV. Having fled the city earlier, she opportunistically joined the forces attacking Caesar and Cleopatra. A faction of the army even proclaimed her queen, adding a third claimant to the throne and creating even more confusion. Arsinoe proved to be just as ambitious and dangerous as her sister. This was not a simple family feud. It was a ruthless scramble for total control where blood ties were irrelevant. Arsinoe even orchestrated the assassination of the general Achilles, replacing him with her own commander, Ganymedes, to consolidate her power over the military. However, this infighting among the Egyptian leadership eventually undermined their coordination, which played right into Caesar's hands. The stalemate finally broke with the arrival of Roman reinforcements. Caesar had sent out messages for help, and eventually legions arrived from Syria under the command of Mithridates of Pergamon. These fresh, battle-hardened troops allowed Caesar to go on the offensive. The decisive confrontation occurred near the Nile Delta in the spring of 47 BCE. Ptolemy XIII, trying to lead his troops, attempted to flee across the Nile. During the chaos, his boat capsized and the teenage king drowned. Some accounts suggest the weight of his golden armor pulled him down. His death marked the end of the Alexandrian War, a tragic finale for a boy king who had been used as a pawn by his own advisors. It is a grim reminder of the cost of such high-stakes political games. With Ptolemy XIII dead and Arsinoe in custody, Caesar had the authority to dictate the future of Egypt. He established Cleopatra as the undisputed ruler, though there was a condition. Following the tradition of her father's will, she was required to marry and rule alongside her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, a boy of only about 12. This was a strategic move by Caesar to ensure Egypt remained stable and compliant. A child co-ruler was much less threatening than a fully independent queen, even one Caesar cared for. This arrangement also allowed Caesar to avoid formally annexing Egypt, which might have caused riots or rebellions. Egypt kept its title as an independent kingdom, but in reality, it was now underpinned by Roman authority. The war served as a brutal education for everyone involved. For Cleopatra, it secured her crown but bound her fate to Rome. For Caesar, it was a perilous distraction that almost killed him, but ultimately secured a crucial grain supply for his empire. For Egypt, it signaled the beginning of the end of true sovereignty, as the kingdom became entangled in the complex web of Roman politics. Cleopatra's reign was now secure, but it was a throne supported by Roman legions. The scene was set for the next chapter of her life, her deepening relationship with Caesar and the massive shifts it would cause. With the war over and the political board reset, the story was far from finished. Although Caesar's decrees had officially resolved the dispute, leaving Cleopatra at the absolute peak of her influence within Egypt, she remained acutely conscious that her position relied entirely on Roman strength. Her co-ruler and younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, served as nothing more than a puppet, a child monarch kept in place simply to satisfy Roman preferences regarding joint rule and to honor the terms of their father's testament. Now established as the undisputed senior leader, Cleopatra immediately began tightening her grip on the government. Merely occupying the throne wasn't enough for her. She was determined to resurrect the glory of the Ptolemaic line, or at the very least, guarantee it survived in an era increasingly controlled by Rome. This mission went beyond simple ego. It was a fight for the very existence of her historic realm. However, while she navigated these political complexities and the heavy lifting of post-war reconstruction, a personal evolution was taking place that would eventually alter the course of history. During the intense months of the Alexandrian War, the bond between Julius Caesar and Cleopatra had grown significantly stronger. Surviving the siege, facing mortal danger, and making critical decisions side by side naturally created a deep connection. Caesar, a brilliant and charming figure in his own right, was undeniably drawn to her wit, her charisma, and her rare capacity to meet him as an intellectual equal. This wasn't just a casual affair with a foreign ruler. It was a meeting of minds between two of the era's most remarkable individuals. While ancient records confirm her beauty, it was really her linguistic skills, her sharp intelligence, and her royal presence that ensnared the Roman general. Whether this union was a cold political calculation or a passionate romance is still a subject of historical debate, but it was almost certainly a blend of both. Relationships are complicated enough without adding the pressure of running empires. It was during this time, likely around June of 47 BCE, that the queen gave birth to a son. This boy, the product of Egypt's queen and Rome's dictator, was named Ptolemy Caesar, though he is best remembered by his nickname, Caesarion or Little Caesar. The arrival of this child was a monumental event. For Cleopatra, the baby was the ultimate validation of her reign, offering a potential heir who carried the blood of two massive powers. He stood as a living symbol of her influence over the most powerful man on earth. For Caesar, on the other hand, the situation was far more politically dangerous. Cleopatra made no secret that Caesarion was Caesar's son, but Caesar never officially confirmed it. In the Roman world, admitting to an illegitimate child was a legal minefield, particularly since Caesar already had an adopted heir in his great-nephew, Octavian. Recognizing Caesarion legally would have been seen as naming a legitimate heir, which could upend Roman politics and spark rumors that he was trying to start a monarchy, something the Republic hated. It was a high-stakes paternity issue that could topple governments. However, Caesar did permit her to use his name for the boy, a quiet but clear admission of fatherhood. He also lingered in Egypt for months after the fighting stopped, taking what amounted to a long vacation with Cleopatra to cruise the Nile and debate with Egyptian scholars. For a general with a republic to manage, this extended holiday showed just how deep his feelings ran. During this time, he helped Cleopatra secure her administration, giving advice on governance and backing her domestic agenda. He understood that a stable, friendly Egypt was vital for Rome, particularly because of its massive grain harvest needed to feed the Roman people. In return, Cleopatra proved her loyalty and her grasp of Roman politics. She surely displayed the luxury and power of her land, framing Egypt as a wealthy partner rather than a defeated territory. This partnership, sealed by their romance and their son, created a formidable alliance in the Mediterranean. But the longer Caesar remained away, the more Rome began to whisper. His troops were getting antsy, and although he controlled the politics back home, he needed to return. After this extended honeymoon, he finally left in the summer of 47 BCE, leaving Cleopatra in command with Caesarion. He left behind 3 legions, ostensibly to keep her safe and protect Roman interests, but they also served as a reminder of who was really in charge. Their separation wasn't the end, though. Caesar planned to bring her to Rome. Caesarion's birth was a turning point for the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was a daring strategy to link the kingdom's survival to the fate of Rome's leader. For a queen who had just fought to get her crown back, having Caesar's son was the ultimate declaration of her ambition for a stronger Egypt. They couldn't have known that this little Caesar would become a pawn in a much larger struggle, viewed as a threat by some and a beacon of hope by others, before becoming a tragic casualty of history. But his birth paved the way for Cleopatra's journey to Rome, a trip that would forever tie her legacy to the center of the Roman world. With her infant son now a few months old and her throne secure, Cleopatra undertook her most audacious action yet, traveling to Rome. Think about how bold that was. A foreign queen arriving in the capital of a republic that had spent centuries looking down on monarchs with suspicion. This was more than a social visit. It was a strategic power play designed to cement her bond with Caesar and showcase her status. Historians still wonder if she went for politics or simply to be with the father of her child. Most likely, it was a mix of both, ambition and affection intertwined. Caesar was now back in Rome, victorious against rebellions and named dictator for life. He was at the peak of his influence and invited her personally, showing how much he valued her and Egypt. He even set her up in a luxury villa across the Tiber on the Janiculum Hill. It was a prime location overlooking the city. You can picture the judgmental Roman elite watching this exotic group arrive. Cleopatra brought her brother husband, the baby Caesarion, and a massive team of servants and treasures. This wasn't just a visit. It was a spectacle meant to dazzle and intimidate. Her arrival caused an instant stir. Rome had never seen anything like her. Used to modest local women, the Romans were shocked and fascinated by her wealth and style. She wore jewels and silks, her entourage spoke strange languages, and she radiated the mystery of the East. The public flocked to see her. The forum would have been buzzing with gossip about her looks, her brain, and her hold over their general. People whispered about her beauty and the shocking fact that she spoke Latin. Caesar added fuel to the fire by treating her almost like an equal. He placed a golden statue of her inside the temple of Venus Genitrix, right beside the statue of the goddess herself. This was a massive honor, but to traditional Romans, it was practically blasphemy. It was like putting a girlfriend's photo in a holy shrine, but with huge political implications. This act infuriated senators who saw it as proof that Caesar wanted to be a king and ignored republican traditions. To them, Cleopatra stood for everything they hated: foreign rule, autocracy, and excess. Cleopatra's stay in the city continued for nearly 2 years, spanning from late 46 BCE to early 44 BCE. Throughout this interval, she threw extravagant banquets, debated with Roman intellectuals, reportedly dazzling Cicero with her mind before he later turned up his nose at her, and solidified her status as a conspicuous fixture in Caesar's inner circle. Furthermore, Caesarion wandered the halls as visible proof of their connection, a living, breathing symbol of their union. Although Caesar stopped short of officially naming the boy his heir within Rome, the child's physical similarities to his father were reportedly the subject of intense gossip, rendering any denial of paternity nearly impossible. Displaying this unique family structure, no matter how strange it seemed to Roman sensibilities, further entrenched Cleopatra as Caesar's most important foreign partner and his closest companion. However, her residency was certainly not free of critics. A great number of powerful Romans, especially those who were terrified of Caesar's expanding authority and apparent drift toward monarchy, looked upon Cleopatra with deep distrust and anger. To them, she was a dangerous queen from the east, a temptress who was rotting the republic's values from the inside and corrupting their leader. This backlash wasn't merely political, it carried heavy moral and cultural weight. Traditionalists in Rome prided themselves on simplicity and civic duty, so Cleopatra's unapologetic display of wealth and power rubbed them the wrong way. Rumors regarding Eastern decadence started to swirl, planting the seeds for the propaganda battles that would come later. While historians continue to debate exactly how much her presence shifted public opinion, there is no doubt she was a lightning rod for controversy. Yet despite the rising hostility from specific groups, her hold on Caesar remained absolute. She experienced the reality of Roman society, watched the political gears turn, and undoubtedly absorbed critical lessons about how Romans thought. She witnessed the immense sway of the Senate, the unpredictable rage of the mob, and the ruthless ambition that defined every layer of the city's politics. These insights would become essential for her survival later on. Her time in the capital served as a masterclass in Roman statecraft, and she was a diligent student. She had no way of knowing, however, that this era of incredible influence and seemingly unbreakable security was about to crash down in sudden violence. Conspiracies were brewing, and the bedrock of the Roman Republic was about to shake. After nearly 2 years of fascinating and shocking the city, living in unmatched luxury at Caesar's side, Cleopatra's world was about to break apart. The date was March 15, 44 BCE. A day that history would forever remember as the Ides of March. On that unassuming spring day, Julius Caesar, her lover, the father of her child, and the guarantee of her reign, was butchered in an act of brutal political savagery. Senators who feared he was becoming a king stabbed him repeatedly, and he famously fell dead at the base of Pompey's statue. It was a violent, stunning conclusion for the man who had redesigned the world, sending panic across the Mediterranean. One can only imagine the disbelief, terror, and absolute mayhem that engulfed Rome. From her villa on the other side of the Tiber, Cleopatra would have felt the seismic shock immediately. The news surely spread like wildfire, transforming from a terrified whisper into a deafening reality. Her patron, her protector, the man who controlled the destiny of her kingdom, was gone. In an instant, her carefully built life of safety and influence collapsed. Her standing in Rome, which had been untouchable under Caesar's protection, became instantly dangerous. She was a foreign monarch with an illegitimate son in a city now drowning in paranoia and uncertainty. The very senators who hated her and resented Caesar were now holding the reins of power, making her vulnerability painfully obvious. This went beyond personal tragedy. It was a catastrophic political disaster. Rome immediately descended into pandemonium. The assassins, led by Gaius Cassius Longinus and Marcus Junius Brutus, thought they were saving the Republic, but they actually triggered a new wave of instability and civil war. The public, initially shocked, quickly turned against the conspirators, fired up by the speeches of Caesar's loyal general, Marc Antony, and the revelation that Caesar's will left generous gifts to the people. Instead of being restored, the Republic sank into an even darker pit of maneuvering and power struggles. Cleopatra, ever the realist, realized that remaining in the city was no longer an option. It was too volatile, too risky, and without Caesar, her presence was nothing but a liability. Her main concern had to be the safety of her son, Caesarion. As Caesar's only biological child, even without official recognition in Rome, Caesarion posed a threat to anyone trying to claim Caesar's legacy. He was a walking symbol of the dictatorship for life, and the monarchical style the assassins claimed to despise. His existence was also an awkward complication for Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, who was stepping up as the primary political successor. Seeing the extreme danger, Cleopatra made the smart and quick decision to retreat to Egypt. It was a withdrawal, certainly, but a strategic one. She departed Rome around April 44 BCE, only weeks after the murder. The trip home must have been filled with anxiety. She had arrived as an honored guest under Caesar's protection. She left as a fleeing monarch, escaping a chaotic city with her future in doubt and her shield gone. She likely traveled with a smaller entourage, heading back to the familiarity and relative safety of Alexandria. While the Egyptian treasury was surely lighter after her Roman vacation, she returned with invaluable political experience and, most importantly, her son. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra found new problems waiting for her. Her brother-husband, Ptolemy XIV, who had been a passive figurehead, died shortly after she got back, likely around the time of her arrival. The details of his death remain mysterious, with many ancient sources suspecting poison and hinting at Cleopatra's hand in it. Historians still debate whether he died of a convenient illness, or if Cleopatra removed her final co-ruler to consolidate total power and ensure Caesarion's path to the throne. Given the ruthless history of Ptolemaic politics and her own track record, it is entirely possible she hastened his end. With Ptolemy XIV out of the picture, Cleopatra immediately elevated Caesarion, officially naming him Ptolemy XV Caesarion, Pharaoh of Egypt alongside his mother. This was a definitive statement. Caesarion was her legitimate heir, and Egypt's future belonged to him. It was a bold move, particularly given the turmoil happening in Rome. Cleopatra now faced a completely different geopolitical map. The Roman Republic was ripping itself apart, and powerful men, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, Octavian, and Marc Antony, were scrambling for control, building shifting alliances for the next round of civil war. Egypt, with its massive wealth and grain supply, was a prize every faction wanted. Cleopatra had to pivot her strategy from relying on a personal bond with one dominant leader to playing a complex diplomatic game with multiple, often hostile Roman forces. Her survival, and the survival of her kingdom, relied on her ability to predict what these new strongmen would do and align with the winner. The era of comfortable intimacy in Rome was over. A new age of ruthless survival had started. With Caesar dead and Rome in the grip of civil war, Cleopatra sat on her throne in Alexandria, no longer an influential guest, but a lone queen in a precarious position. The stability her relationship with Caesar had guaranteed was gone. replaced by a confusing mess of Roman factions fighting for dominance. Her first task was to secure her grip on Egypt and shield Caesarion, now officially Ptolemy XV, from the political storms blowing in from Rome. This required maintaining peace at home while closely watching the chaotic Roman landscape. It was like trying to forecast the tracks of a dozen hurricanes simultaneously. Over in Rome, the situation was a swirling vortex of betrayal and alliances. The power vacuum Caesar left behind was rapidly being filled by three primary contenders. First, there was Marc Antony, Caesar's charismatic and loyal lieutenant. As a brilliant speaker and formidable general, Antony rose quickly as a major force, riding the wave of public anger over the assassination and his own popularity with the troops. He embodied the ideal of a Roman powerhouse, driven by action and grand aspirations. Then there was Octavian, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son. Only 18 years old, Octavian was initially underestimated, but he held a cold, calculating mind, ruthless drive, and a sharp grasp of politics. He was the silent tempest, the threat no one saw coming. Finally, there was Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a general who was less flashy but still powerful as Caesar's master of horse, essentially his second-in-command. Lepidus acted as a more cautious figure, often playing the mediator between the two bigger personalities. Realizing that fighting one another would only lead to ruin, these three men decided to join forces. In 43 BCE, they officially established the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the first informal alliance, this was a legal entity sanctioned by the Senate, granting them extraordinary authority to restore the Republic, a phrase dripping with irony. Their primary objective was to hunt down the men who had assassinated Caesar, specifically Brutus and Cassius, who were busy amassing armies in the east. This new regime effectively split the Roman world into personal territories. Octavian took command of the West and Italy, while Lepidus was assigned Africa and parts of Spain, though his influence was already beginning to fade. Antony secured the eastern provinces, which placed Egypt squarely within his jurisdiction. For Cleopatra, this political shift was a pivotal moment. With Egypt situated in the east, she now had to answer directly to Antony. She remembered him from her time with Caesar, viewing him as a competent, if slightly unpredictable, leader. Her main goal, however, was protecting her throne. She had to navigate the Roman civil war without picking a side too obviously. While she secretly favored Caesar's avengers, she couldn't afford to provoke the republican forces of Brutus and Cassius that were currently dominating the region. Historians still debate exactly how much she interfered, but she undoubtedly walked a tightrope between neutrality and subtle support. When Cassius demanded tribute and supplies to fund his war against the triumvirs, Cleopatra played a clever diplomatic game. She dispatched a tiny fleet, but claimed that a storm had damaged her ships, using this as an excuse for her meager contribution. It was a brilliant move that allowed her to avoid looking like an enemy to the assassins while holding back real support. She was effectively hedging her bets, waiting to see who would come out on top. The conflict finally came to a head in 42 BCE at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia. In a brutal two-stage engagement, the combined forces of Antony and Octavian completely destroyed the Republican armies. Brutus and Cassius both took their own lives to avoid capture, cementing the triumvirate's control. This came as a massive relief to Cleopatra. With Caesar's killers dead, she could drop the charade and openly align herself with the victors. Her gamble had paid off. Following the victory, Antony stood as the undisputed ruler of the Roman East. His job was massive. He needed to reorganize client kingdoms, collect taxes, and punish any remaining enemies to fund the triumvirate's future plans. This required a grand tour of the region to demand loyalty and resources. Naturally, the wealthiest and most important stop on this list was Egypt. This set the scene for one of history's most famous encounters. Cleopatra, having navigated the chaos following Caesar's death, was about to meet a man whose ambition matched her own and whose fate would become permanently linked with hers. Fresh from his victory at Philippi, Antony's mission was to bring order to an East that had been destabilized by civil war. This wasn't just a polite visit, it was a projection of Roman power intended to secure the region. Of all the rulers summoned to answer to him, none mattered more than the Queen of Egypt. In late 41 BCE, he sent a command, not a request, for Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, in modern-day Turkey. Antony, known for his love of spectacle, likely expected her to arrive as a humble, wealthy subordinate begging forgiveness for her lukewarm support during the war. He probably imagined he could easily intimidate her with his authority and charm. Instead, he was walked into a masterclass of psychological theater. Cleopatra knew she had to make an impression that went beyond mere obedience. She needed to awe him with the ancient majesty of her kingdom. She intentionally delayed her arrival, forcing Antony to wait in Tarsus and letting the anticipation build, a subtle power play to show she wasn't at his beck and call. When she finally appeared, she didn't come by land. She arrived via the Cydnus River on a barge that became the stuff of legend. Picture a vessel with a gold-plated stern, purple sails soaked in perfume, and silver oars rowing to the beat of flutes and harps. Cleopatra reclined under a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite or Isis. Her maids posed as sea nymphs and graces, while young boys fanned her like cupids. The spectacle was so overwhelming that the crowds in Tarsus abandoned Antony on his tribunal to rush to the riverbanks, drawn by the music and scents. He was completely upstaged. Whether every detail happened exactly as Plutarch described is up for debate, but the result was undeniable. Cleopatra had seized control of the narrative. Intrigued and outmaneuvered, Antony invited her to dinner. She countered, insisting he come to her instead. He agreed, and the banquets she hosted were legendary for their excess. Stories tell of her spending fortunes on these events, even dissolving a priceless pearl in vinegar and drinking it to mock Roman frugality and display her limitless wealth. These weren't just parties, they were high-stakes negotiations. Antony had come for money and explanations, but Cleopatra used her fluency in Greek, her wit, and her charm to flip the script. She successfully blamed her brother's advisors for any past disloyalty and convinced Antony that a stable, rich Egypt was his greatest asset. Antony, who had a weakness for luxury and brilliant women, was totally captivated. He saw a partner who could fuel his ambitions, and a woman he found intellectually and physically irresistible. What started as a summons turned into a defining political and romantic alliance. By late 41 BCE, Antony was so entranced that he set aside his administrative duties. Leaving his officers in charge, he followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria. You can imagine the rumors flying among his staff, concerned that their powerful Roman leader was losing his focus to the Oriental queen. Marc Antony, however, was a man who loved to live largely and embrace excess, and he didn't seem to mind the criticism one bit. Instead of attending to his official duties, he spent the winter of 4140 BCE in Alexandria, completely abandoning his work to dive headfirst into Cleopatra's world. It turned into a massive, extended vacation full of feasts, live shows, and deep intellectual conversations. Together, they created a legendary drinking club called the Inimitable Livers, where they played complex games and held elaborate contests. There is a famous story, perhaps a bit exaggerated, but it illustrates the point, where Cleopatra won a bet by melting a priceless pearl into a cup of vinegar and drinking it, just to prove the sheer scale of her wealth. Historians still debate whether these wild stunts were just for publicity or if they genuinely lived that lavishly, but it is obvious that their standard of living made even Roman luxury look small by comparison. Throughout that winter in Alexandria, their personal connection became permanently stronger. Cleopatra used her vast knowledge of the East and her sharp political skills to provide Antony with crucial insights into the complicated region he was now supposed to govern. She acted as much more than a queen. She was a strategic counselor and a partner in ruling, giving him a perspective that very few Romans possessed. For Antony, who generally liked taking action more than doing administrative paperwork, her intelligence and grasp of subtle Eastern politics must have been incredibly attractive. He viewed her as more than just a romantic partner. She was a powerful ally with a kingdom full of the resources he needed for his political goals and military campaigns. This partnership produced literal results very quickly. In 40 BCE, while Antony was away from Egypt, Cleopatra delivered twins, a son called Alexander Helios, meaning sun, which linked him to the east and perhaps served as a nod to Alexander the Great, and a daughter named Cleopatra Selene, meaning moon, representing her celestial counterpart. In the ancient world, the birth of twins, especially a boy and a girl, was viewed as a very lucky omen, highlighting the godlike nature of their union and the potential for a new dynasty that would mix the power of Rome and Egypt. Coming after Caesarion, these children further cemented the personal and family bonds between Cleopatra and Antony. It sent a clear message to the world that their relationship was serious, productive, and designed to create a permanent legacy. However, Antony staying away in Egypt for so long created major political headaches back in Rome. As he partied with Cleopatra, his wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius Antonius started a rebellion against Octavian in Italy, which became known as the Perusian War. Even though this conflict ultimately failed, the chaos forced Antony to leave Cleopatra's side and head back to Rome to deal with the fallout. This served as a harsh reminder that no matter how powerful he was in the East, he was still stuck in the unstable politics of the Roman Republic and his shaky alliance with Octavian. Cleopatra surely realized he had to go, but the separation must have been painful after such an intense period together. When he returned to Italy, the power dynamics of the Triumvirate demanded that Antony make peace with Octavian. They sealed this reconciliation with the Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BCE, which divided the Roman world once again, and most significantly for Antony, required him to marry Octavia the Younger, Octavian's sister. This political marriage was a blatant attempt to strengthen the fragile bond between the two leaders. Picture Cleopatra's reaction when this news reached her in Alexandria. The man who had lived in her palace all winter, fathered her children, and seemingly pledged his loyalty, had now married his rival's sister. It was a cruel lesson in how temporary personal loyalty could be when political survival was at stake, highlighting the brutal reality of Roman power games. Scholars still argue about her exact feelings. Was it rage, a sense of betrayal, or just a cynical understanding of how the game was played? It was likely a combination of all three. Even with this political marriage, Antony's heart and his strategic interests remained focused on the East, and ultimately on Cleopatra. While his marriage to Octavia resulted in 2 daughters and was considered a relatively happy and respectable union by Roman standards, it was born of political necessity, not passion or a strategic partnership. Everything was now set for the next phase of their complex story, where Antony would increasingly look back toward Egypt, toward Cleopatra, and toward the grand dreams they shared, making Octavian in Rome angrier by the day. So Antony found himself in a rather awkward position, being politically married to Octavian's sister. His biggest ambitions, and likely his heart, remained firmly in the East with Cleopatra. The marriage to Octavia was essentially a strategic truce in the uneasy alliance of the Second Triumvirate, but it did little to weaken his deep bond with the Queen of Egypt. Following the Treaty of Brundisium in 40 BCE, he spent several years campaigning in the East, dealing with the Parthian threat and securing Rome's presence. However, his thoughts, and eventually his actions, kept drifting back to Alexandria. It is somewhat like sitting at a sensible, polite dinner while secretly wishing for the wild, exotic feast you enjoyed the week before. During this time apart, from 40 BCE to 37 BCE, Cleopatra continued to rule Egypt while raising her young children, Caesarion and the twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. She concentrated on strengthening her kingdom, managing its vast resources, and keeping it stable during the ongoing Roman turmoil. She also continued to build up Alexandria as a hub of culture and learning, bringing in scholars and artists to maintain the Ptolemaic tradition of intellectual patronage. She waited patiently, knowing that Antony would eventually return to her side. The turning point arrived in 37 BCE, when Antony, tired of his political duties in Rome and eager to launch a massive attack against the Parthian Empire, a dangerous Roman enemy in the east, needed significant money and logistical help. The best place to find that support was in the wealthy treasury of Egypt, under the capable leadership of Cleopatra. So he sent for her, and they reunited in Antioch in modern-day Turkey. This reunion took their relationship to the next level and showed a blatant disregard for his marriage to Octavia, an insult that Octavian would never forget and certainly never forgive. It was during this meeting in Antioch that Antony made a series of shocking decisions which became known as the donations of Antioch. These weren't just simple gifts, they were massive transfers of Roman-controlled territory to Cleopatra and her children. He effectively handed over huge areas of land, including parts of Cilicia, Phoenicia, Syria, Cyprus, and even pieces of Judea and Arabia. Imagine just giving away chunks of your country's property to your foreign partner. This was a completely unprecedented move for a Roman general, and it caused panic across the Roman world. Historians still debate whether Antony was motivated by romantic love for Cleopatra, a smart political calculation to build a loyal buffer state in the east, or a mix of both. It was probably a generous combination, much like a strong ancient Roman cocktail. For Cleopatra, these donations represented a massive victory. They not only significantly expanded her wealth and borders, making her the most powerful monarch in the eastern Mediterranean, but they also formalized the dynastic plans she shared with Antony. These lands were meant to be ruled by her, and crucially, by her children with Antony. It was a clear signal that Antony planned to build a new empire in the east, with Egypt at its center and Cleopatra's children as its future rulers. She stopped being just a client queen and became a full partner in empire building, sharing a vision that directly threatened Octavian's authority and his plans for Rome. However, regarding public opinion in Rome, this act was a colossal strategic mistake. Octavian and his allies immediately used the donations of Antioch as undeniable proof that Antony had surrendered completely to Cleopatra and her alleged Oriental decadence. They portrayed him as a man corrupted by an exotic foreign queen, abandoning Roman values and actively carving up the Republic to build a new foreign monarchy. The propaganda machine kicked into high gear, carefully spinning a narrative that demonized Cleopatra as a dangerous sorceress who threatened Roman morality and the very existence of the Republic. This was character assassination on a massive scale, setting the stage for the inevitable war. Adding fuel to the fire, Antony and Cleopatra held a grand public ceremony to legitimize their twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, as well as Caesarion, even though Antony still hadn't formally acknowledged him as Caesar's son under Roman law. Dressed in royal clothes, the children were paraded before the public and proclaimed rulers of these newly granted territories. It was a bold, defiant assertion of their dynasty, and a direct challenge to Octavian's claim as the sole heir to Caesar's legacy. In his typical grandiose style, Antony seemed totally unconcerned with what the Romans thought. To put it simply, he was living his best life, consequences be damned. From this point on, the conflict between Antony and Octavian became personal, deeply ideological, and impossible to resolve. The donations of Antioch were not just about changing borders. They were a statement of intent for an Eastern empire centered on Egypt, which fundamentally opposed Octavian's vision of a Roman-centered West. Cleopatra had gained immense power and influence, but she had also become the lightning rod for Octavian's carefully crafted narrative of Roman exceptionalism and moral purity. With the atmosphere charged, the curtain was rising on the grand finale of the Roman civil wars. Antony and Cleopatra stood squarely in the middle of this drama, moving toward a future that promised both majesty and heartbreak. As mentioned earlier, the donations of Antioch were far more than simple administrative changes regarding land. They landed like a lightning bolt, announcing Antony's bold plan for an Eastern empire centered around the Egyptian queen and their shared offspring. However, in the cutthroat arena of Roman public relations, this drastic step proved to be a massive tactical error. Over in the capital, Caesar's adopted son wasn't idly watching these events unfold. Octavian was meticulously recording every move, constructing a damning argument against his rival, and even more effectively against the queen. The scene was primed for a battle of narratives that makes today's political mudslinging seem like polite conversation. Being a genius at swaying the masses and navigating politics, Octavian realized a blunt charge of treason against Antony wouldn't stick. Instead, he initiated a systematic, multi-layered character assassination aimed at painting Antony as a man who had lost his Roman soul, and Cleopatra as the corrupting, foreign influence responsible for his fall. This went beyond simple rumor-mongering. It was a calculated, relentless mission to turn the hearts of Rome against the couple. He broadcast his biased version of events loudly in the Forum, sketching a shocking portrait of their alleged depravity. The core of this strategy involved casting Cleopatra as a perilous, Oriental queen and sorceress who had ensnared Antony and was plotting Rome's enslavement. This narrative tapped perfectly into deep-seated Roman suspicions about the East, which they often associated with softness, excess, and moral rot. Rather than a legitimate ruler, she was branded a whore queen, to use the era's lovely terminology, bent on destroying the Republic. Even her stunning arrival at Tarsus, once a display of royal power, was spun by Octavian's PR team as proof of wasteful indulgence and un-Roman behavior. While scholars still debate whether the Roman hatred for her was genuine or manufactured, it clearly worked well enough to turn the tide of opinion. Antony found himself in the crosshairs as well. He was slammed for leaving his Roman wife, Octavian's own sister, for a foreign lover, which was framed as evidence of his declining morality. His embrace of Egyptian traditions and the public spectacle of the donations of Alexandria, where he gave land to his children with the queen, were presented as concrete evidence that he had betrayed his heritage. The propaganda machine insisted Antony was merely a puppet, so blinded by love that he would hand over Roman lands and relocate the empire's capital to Alexandria. Agents spread the fear that glorious Rome would soon bow to an Egyptian monarch, triggering intense national pride and xenophobia. The ultimate nightmare scenario presented was that the couple planned a universal monarchy, ruling as despots and conquering Rome itself. This stoked the old Roman terror of kings and pharaohs, painting a picture of citizens forced to worship foreign gods and obey foreign laws. Octavian even claimed Cleopatra intended to sit in judgment on the Capitoline Hill, a thought that horrified proud Romans, even if it was a massive exaggeration. Octavian also kept a dossier of Antony's faults. In a dramatic move, he got hold of Antony's will and read it aloud to the Senate. The document allegedly stated Antony's wish to be buried in Alexandria with the queen, which Octavian presented as undeniable proof that Antony had abandoned Rome for Egypt. The public was appalled. It was the ancient version of leaking scandalous emails, but with much more theatrical flair. This persistent smear campaign worked wonders. By the time war was imminent, the Roman people were firmly against the pair. Octavian successfully branded the upcoming fight not as a civil war between Romans, but as a holy defense of Roman values against a dangerous foreign enemy. He turned a messy political rivalry into a binary clash between Roman virtue and Eastern corruption. Whether Octavian believed his own hype or not is up for debate, but the result was clear. The public was ready for a showdown with the fated lovers. With the propaganda reaching a crescendo and tensions over territory and insults boiling over, open warfare was the only remaining option. The Triumvirate's shaky alliance was dead, setting the stage for a collision between the West under Octavian and the East under Antony and Cleopatra. It was like two superpowers facing off, just with more personal vendettas and fewer nuclear weapons. Knowing a fight was coming, Antony rallied his massive army of legions and client troops, along with a significant navy. Cleopatra brought Egypt's vast treasury, resources, and fleet to the effort. She wasn't just writing checks, she was a full partner and sovereign co-commander in this dangerous enterprise. Her ships, constructed from Egyptian wood and crewed by expert sailors, were vital. With her kingdom's future on the line, she was all in. They decided to force a naval confrontation at the Gulf of Actium on Greece's west coast. This wasn't a random pick. The location provided a defensive bay for their fleet, where they set up their primary base. While they outnumbered Octavian's fleet, many of the Queen's ships were designed for the Nile and Red Sea, making them heavier and slower than the agile Roman vessels. Historians often point to this technical difference as a pivotal factor in what happened next. The legendary Battle of Actium took place on September 2, 31 BCE. Picture the chaos, hundreds of ships and thousands of men swarming the Ionian Sea. The atmosphere was heavy with fear, sweat, and the anticipation of violence. As trumpets sounded and oars slapped the water, an epic display of ancient naval power began. Antony took charge of the center line, while Cleopatra, symbolizing their unity, stationed her 60 Egyptian vessels in the rear position. These ships in the rear were reportedly carrying the massive royal treasury. As we are about to discover, the positioning of this wealth would spark significant controversy and debate. The conflict itself was ferocious and disorganized. Antony's heavy warships were intimidating, but they had trouble maneuvering against the lighter, faster vessels led by Octavian's brilliant admiral, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Agrippa, a tactical mastermind famous for inventing new naval methods, perfectly utilized his speed advantage to surround and cut off Antony's lumbering giants. Because this was a Roman civil war, the tragedy lay in Romans killing fellow Romans, a wasteful loss of life that had become all too common in previous decades. The soldiers weren't fighting for patriotism, they were fighting for loyalty to a specific warlord. Then a moment occurred that would forever define this battle story and seal the fate of the famous couple, the infamous retreat. While the combat was at its fiercest, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly raised their sails, punched a hole through the battle lines, and fled toward the open sea. When Antony saw her fleet leaving, he reportedly jumped from his flagship to a faster vessel and chased after her. Historians have endlessly debated this move. Was it a pre-planned strategic withdrawal designed to save the money and their lives for a future battle? Or was it a moment of sheer panic and a betrayal of the cause? Roman accounts, heavily influenced by Octavian's propaganda, described it as pure cowardice, proof that Antony had been emasculated by his foreign lover. They claimed he followed his Egyptian mistress like a servant. Scholars still question whether Cleopatra's flight was a calculated move to escape a losing naval battle to fight on land, or simply a spontaneous decision to run away. One theory suggests that she saw their heavy ships getting encircled and made a desperate dash for freedom to save whatever resources and troops she could. Regardless of the motivation, Antony's choice to follow her destroyed the morale and loyalty of the men he left behind. His leaderless fleet was crushed by Agrippa, and his land armies, hearing that their general had fled, defected to Octavian en masse over the next few days. The Battle of Actium was a total victory for Octavian, both militarily and psychologically. It signaled the absolute end of the dream to build an Eastern empire and paved the way for Octavian's sole rule. The couple's return to Egypt wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a terrified flight toward a dark future, leaving behind a destroyed fleet and a crumbling army. It seemed the sun was setting on the final great Hellenistic kingdom and the tragic romance that had dared to challenge Rome. The world watched as the once mighty figures of Antony and Cleopatra began a slow, unavoidable slide into ruin. The disaster at Actium was more than a lost battle. It was a political and mental catastrophe for the couple. Their grand plans lay broken on the Ionian Sea, and their immediate reaction was to flee back to Egypt. Picture the gloomy atmosphere on Cleopatra's ship as they sailed away from the disaster, surrounded by whispers of failure and the terrifying realization that their world had changed forever. Antony, having abandoned his troops, must have been crushed by the humiliation. his massive ego shattered. Back in Egypt, they faced a harsh truth. Octavian was coming, and he was bringing the full power of Rome's victorious army. There was no way to avoid the final showdown. However, even while defeated, Antony and Cleopatra showed surprising resilience. They knew their time was short, but they were determined to use it, either by preparing for a last stand or trying desperate diplomatic gambles. Experts still argue over whether their actions in these final months showed strategic planning, or just the frantic panic of two rulers losing their grip. It was likely a tragic combination of both, mixed with moments of deep depression and defiant partying. Antony took the defeat particularly hard. He sank into deep despair, isolating himself in a villa on the island of Pharaoh and calling himself Timon after a famous misanthrope. This was a shocking change from his usual loud, sociable personality. Cleopatra, ever the practical one, refused to give up. She started preparing defenses and even planned an escape. She hatched a scheme to drag her remaining ships across the Isthmus of Suez to the Red Sea, hoping to sail to distant lands like India, where Rome couldn't touch them. The idea of hauling warships overland was a logistical nightmare that showed her desperation to save her dynasty and children. Sadly, this bold plan failed when local tribes burned the ships, proving that fate was working against them. Despite the failures, life in Alexandria under Cleopatra became surreal. Knowing the end might be near, they reportedly spent their time in lavish luxury and partying. This wasn't necessarily frivolous. It may have been a way to project strength to their people and themselves, a defiant final celebration before the end. They even started a new society called Companions in Death, a grim update to their old inimitable livers club. The morbid name hints at a dark humor and a resigned acceptance that they would face their fate together. These gatherings were acts of shared fatalism, a method to numb the fear of what was coming. Meanwhile, Octavian was busy. He secured control over the Roman East to ensure no one could help the lovers. He moved slowly but steadily toward Egypt, tightening his grip. His propaganda machine worked overtime, framing his invasion as a liberation of Egypt from a corrupt queen and a tyrant rather than a brutal conquest. He spun the story to make it look like a just war to restore Roman honor. As the enemy approached, Antony tried one last desperate rally. He actually won a small skirmish outside Alexandria, which gave him and his loyalists a brief moment of hope. But it didn't last. Most of his soldiers saw the writing on the wall and deserted to Octavian. The end was in sight. Facing total destruction, Cleopatra tried secret diplomacy. She sent messages to Octavian offering to abdicate if he would let her children rule. Octavian, a cold pragmatist, replied with hard terms. Cleopatra had to surrender unconditionally, and Antony had to be handed over. He refused to guarantee her children's safety, but hinted he might spare her life if she gave up Antony. It was a cruel offer meant to drive a wedge between them. Historians debate the details, but it is clear Cleopatra tried everything to save her family. Octavian, however, wanted total victory. The stage was set for the final collapse. With Octavian's legions at the gates of Alexandria in August of 30 BCE, the situation was hopeless. Antony's last units barely fought. His remaining fleet sailed out and immediately surrendered or defected to Octavian without firing a shot. This betrayal was the final humiliation for Antony, proving his power had completely evaporated. His army followed suit, abandoning him entirely. Crushed and confused, Antony went back to the palace where he received a false report that Cleopatra had committed suicide. This was the breaking point. Believing his queen was dead and refusing to be captured, Antony decided to kill himself. He tried to fall on his sword, but in a tragic twist, he botched it. The wound was severe but not instantly fatal. Historians debate if it was a failed suicide or a cry for help, but the result was a slow, painful death. While bleeding out, Antony learned Cleopatra was actually alive, hiding in her tomb monument. He begged to be taken to her. His servants carried him there, but because the doors were locked, Cleopatra and her maids had to pull him up to a window using ropes. It was a heartbreaking scene, with the women struggling to hoist his heavy, dying body. He died in her arms on August 30 BCE, marking the end of one of Rome's most colorful figures. Cleopatra was captured shortly after. Octavian secured her and the treasury, intending to parade her in his triumph in Rome as a trophy of his victory. He placed her under heavy guard, assigning a man named Epaphroditus to watch her constantly to prevent suicide. She was in a gilded cage. She tried one last time to charm Octavian during an interview. She showed him the treasury records, hiding some assets to create intrigue, and appealed to his mercy for her children. She used all her intellect and presence, but Octavian was immune. He saw her only as a political prize. He gave vague answers but offered no real guarantees. Cleopatra realized the truth. Being marched through Rome in chains would be an unbearable humiliation for a goddess queen. She refused to become a trophy. Her capture and subsequent defiance set the scene for a legendary exit. Trapped in her own city with Antony dead, Cleopatra was determined to control her own end. The thought of being a spectacle for the Roman mob was a fate she would not accept. Imagine the mix of despair and pride she felt. The story of her suicide is one of history's great mysteries. The most famous version involves a snake, an asp or Egyptian cobra, a symbol of royalty. Scholars still argue about the specific type of snake, or if it was actually poison or perhaps utilized a different, more subtle technique entirely. Regardless of the specific method, the lasting visualization of the cobra remains potent, serving as a deep symbol of her royal Egyptian roots and her wish for a passing that was both majestic and private. Even though Cleopatra was detained in a fairly opulent wing of the palace, she was watched closely by guards. Nevertheless, she somehow found a way to have her death instrument smuggled inside. The most famous retelling of the event suggests the snake arrived hidden inside a basket of figs, or maybe concealed within a floral arrangement. It seems the guards were either too relaxed or simply negligent, as they didn't bother to properly check the innocent-looking package. This trick highlights her cleverness, even during her bleakest moments, and her absolute refusal to lose control of her story. It was a brilliant maneuver to get past Roman security, transforming a harmless delivery into a tool of ultimate resistance. You could even joke that her strategy was quite fruitful. On August 30 BCE, exactly 11 days following Antony's suicide, the queen made her last arrangements. Accounts say she bathed, put on her most splendid royal garments, and reclined on a golden couch, prepared to face death with grace. She sent a note to Octavian, asking to be interred next to Antony. That final message was a quiet rebellion, proving her undying loyalty to her lover and serving as one last strike against Octavian, who had tried so hard to drive them apart. It was a request, but also a statement of intent. Art often dramatizes the actual moment of death with the snake striking her breast or arm. Ancient texts imply she might have irritated the serpent on purpose, perhaps holding it against her skin to ensure a quick strike. The venom would have caused a slow numbness and paralysis, resulting in a calm passing often described as a divine sleep. This allowed her to die with the royal dignity she craved, escaping the humiliating public display Octavian had planned. By the time Octavian's soldiers realized what was happening and rushed into her room, she was gone. Her devoted servants, Eras and Charmian, were found beside her, either dead or dying, having chosen to accompany their mistress into the afterlife. Even as she was fading, Charmian supposedly adjusted Cleopatra's crown, a final act of loyalty and defiance. When questioned, she reportedly said, "It is well done and fitting for the descendant of so many kings," perfectly capturing the essence of the queen's pride. Cleopatra's suicide achieved its goal. She successfully denied Octavian the satisfaction of marching her through Rome as a trophy. Although he took her fortune and her children, Caesarion, Alexander Helios, and Cleopatra Selene, the victory parade felt incomplete without the living, breathing queen of Egypt. Octavian was apparently annoyed, but also begrudgingly respectful of her defiant exit. he ultimately agreed to bury her with Antony, a move that showed either respect for her spirit or a practical desire to keep the peace in Egypt. That death officially closed the book on the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family line that had governed Egypt for almost 3 centuries. With Cleopatra gone, Egypt was transformed into a direct Roman province managed by a prefect answering to the emperor. Rome now controlled the massive grain supply and wealth that would support the empire for centuries. The age of independent pharaohs was over, shutting the door on a chapter of history that had lasted for millennia. Experts continue to debate the long-term effects of absorbing Egypt. Did that wealth stabilize Rome, or did it just encourage more imperial greed? It certainly made the empire wealthier. By choosing her own end rather than facing the humiliation of a Roman triumph, Cleopatra solidified her legendary status. She went from a beaten ruler to an eternal icon of pride and independence. Her final, mysterious act ensured history would view her not as Octavian's prisoner, but as the formidable queen of Egypt who resisted Rome until her last breath. This tragic but strong finale became the foundation of her myth, making her one of history's most fascinating characters. So Cleopatra, the seventh, Philopator, the final pharaoh, died on her own terms, denying Octavian his ultimate spectacle. Her passing on August 12, 30 BCE, wasn't just the end of a remarkable life. It was the definitive finish line for the Ptolemaic dynasty, the Greek-Macedonian line that had held power for nearly 300 years. This event was a massive shift in ancient history. Egypt, a land of ancient gods, pharaohs, and incredible riches, lost its sovereignty and officially became a Roman province. One can only imagine the silence falling over Alexandria, a city that had been the center of a vibrant empire, now waiting for its new Roman masters. With the queen gone, Octavian immediately moved to fully absorb Egypt into the growing Roman Empire. He recognized the land's immense strategic and economic value. The fertile Nile Delta was essentially the ancient world's farm, growing the vast amounts of grain needed to feed Rome's huge population. Additionally, Egypt's accumulated treasure was a massive boost to the Roman treasury, which had been drained by decades of civil war. Octavian installed a Roman prefect, Gaius Cornelius Gallus, to run the country, signaling that this was no standard province. He treated Egypt as his personal estate, reflecting its unique value and his desire to keep its resources under his direct thumb rather than letting the Senate manage it. It was like he had acquired the world's most profitable private plantation. The annexation brought huge changes. The Ptolemaic government structure, which was largely Greek, was slowly swapped out for Roman systems. Roman legions were stationed permanently to keep the peace and secure the grain routes. Alexandria remained a major business and intellectual hub, but it now operated under Roman authority. The Great Library of Alexandria, having survived damage during Caesar's time, still drew in scholars, but its golden age as the world's unrivaled center of learning began to fade under Roman rule. Historians still argue about exactly when and why the library declined, with some blaming fires and others pointing to a gradual shift in what people studied. The story of Cleopatra's children is, naturally, a heartbreaking part of this transition. Octavian viewed Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, as the biggest threat. As Caesar's only biological child, the boy was a living symbol of the legacy Octavian wanted to claim entirely for himself. Cleopatra had sent Caesarion toward India for safety, perhaps as a last-ditch escape plan, but his tutor Rhodon tricked him into returning by claiming Octavian would be merciful. It was a deadly mistake. Upon his return, following the advice of his close advisor Arrius Didymus, who famously noted, "Too many Caesars is not a good thing," Octavian ordered Caesarion's execution. It was a cold, calculated move to erase any rival to his claim as Caesar's sole heir. The young prince, only 17 years old, met a quiet and brutal end, forever extinguishing Julius Caesar's direct bloodline. It was a rather chilling and practical approach to politics, don't you think? The children Cleopatra had with Antony, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, along with their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome by Octavian. Since they didn't threaten his claim as Caesar's heir like Caesarion did, they were spared. Instead, they were displayed in Octavian's triple triumph in 29 BCE, a public show of Rome's victory over the East and the end of the civil wars. Afterward, they were handed over to Octavia the Younger, Antony's ex-wife and Octavian's sister. Octavia, famous for her kindness and nobility, raised them alongside her own children and Antony's daughters from a previous marriage. It is a surprising, almost gentle twist in a violent story of power. Historians still debate whether Octavia did this out of true kindness or as a savvy political move to display Roman mercy. Maybe it was a bit of both. Cleopatra Selene, the most famous of Antony's children with the queen, eventually married King Juba II of Mauritania, a Roman client king, and became an influential and educated queen herself. Her brothers, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, likely died young or simply disappeared from the records, their fates unclear. Their lives served as proof of the dangerous tides of Roman politics, as they survived only through the mercy of their captor, a far cry from the royal future their parents had planned. Taking over Egypt was a key moment in building the Roman Empire. It gave Octavian the final piece he needed, securing his finances and solidifying his power. With Egypt under his control, he could truly claim to be the master of the Mediterranean. This massive wealth and stability allowed him to start a huge program of construction, military reform, and cultural renewal that would define the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, for centuries. However, it also meant the total destruction of the vibrant, ancient civilization of the pharaohs as a sovereign power. The era of the pharaohs, as an independent entity, was finished. So, with Egypt firmly under Roman rule and the last of her heirs either killed or moved to Rome, the curtain officially fell on Cleopatra's life as a real, independent queen. Yet, even as her life ended, her legend began. It is strange, isn't it, how some people continue to live on centuries after they die, transformed by the fertile soil of human imagination. Cleopatra, more than almost anyone else from ancient times, has grown beyond history to become a universal symbol, meaning different things to different eras. Immediately after she died, the Octavian narrative took over, a powerful state-approved version of events designed to justify his win and strengthen his rule. In this Roman propaganda, Cleopatra wasn't a queen, but a dangerous Oriental temptress who had corrupted the noble Roman Marc Antony and threatened the Republic itself. She was painted as decadent, manipulative, and obsessed with pleasure, a foreign danger to Roman values. This image, heavily shaped by Roman bias against powerful foreign women and Eastern culture, successfully turned her into a villain in the Roman mind. It was a textbook case of the victor dictating the narrative, painting his defeated enemy and his foreign lover in the worst possible colors. Historians still argue about how much this propaganda influenced Roman opinions at the time, but its lasting power is obvious. However, even with that heavy layer of Roman propaganda, glimpses of a more complex figure still managed to shine through in their literature. Poets such as Horace, while busy cheering for Octavian's triumph, still had to admit that she showed noble pride by choosing the manner of her own death. Centuries later, writers like Plutarch provided a version that, while still focused on the Roman perspective, was much more nuanced. He detailed her intelligence, charm, and skill with languages right alongside the more scandalous gossip. These writings, despite their obvious slant, started building the foundation for a much more multi-layered understanding of the queen. During the medieval era, the story of Cleopatra mostly faded into the background or got reinterpreted through a Christian viewpoint. In that context, she was usually cast as a tragic victim of her own passions or a symbol of pagan overindulgence. Her image was frequently lumped in with other powerful but doomed women from ancient history, used as a moral lesson to warn against vice. The focus was almost entirely on her perceived moral shortcomings rather than her political reality. Considering the sheer political brilliance she actually possessed, that was a fairly unfair verdict. When the Renaissance arrived, it brought a renewed obsession with classical history, and Cleopatra stepped back into the spotlight. She became a favorite muse for playwrights, poets, and artists who usually portrayed her in dramatic, high-stakes scenes that highlighted her beauty and tragic romance. The most famous and lasting interpretation from this time is undoubtedly Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra asterisk, written in the early 1600s. Shakespeare's work turned her into a character of massive poetic intensity and tragic grandeur, depicting a woman whose ambition and passion were simultaneously her superpowers and her weaknesses. His version of the Queen is brilliant, impulsive, fiery, and incredibly human. More than any history book, this play fixed her image in the Western imagination as the ultimate femme fatale, a ruler whose love was strong enough to bring empires crashing down. By the 18th and 19th centuries, a cultural fascination with romanticism and the exotic further boosted this mythical version of Cleopatra. She began appearing in popular novels, operas, and paintings, serving as a symbol of dangerous allure and unattainable beauty. The 19th century boom in Egyptology, especially the decoding of hieroglyphs and the discovery of ancient tombs, added a layer of authentic mystique to her legend. She was suddenly draped in the legitimacy of real Egyptian artifacts and art, even if those objects were actually thousands of years older than she was. She effectively became the logo for ancient Egypt itself, representing all its mysteries and splendor. It is truly wild how a single historical person can be so flexible, mirroring the obsessions and fears of whatever time period is looking at her. To the Romans, she was a foreign danger. To Shakespeare, a tragic lover. To the Victorians, an exotic fantasy. Every generation projected their own desires onto her, creating a mix of interpretations that makes it incredibly hard for historians to separate the facts from the fiction. The real woman, the one who spoke many languages and steered her country through cutthroat politics, often gets buried beneath the sparkle of her own legend. Yet, that very ability to shift and change is what keeps her alive in our collective minds. She isn't just a piece of history, she is a cultural phenomenon, existing as both a shouted legend and a whispered secret. This enduring myth, which started with Roman rumors and was polished by centuries of art, kept evolving right into the 20th and 21st centuries, adapting to fit modern tastes. If the Renaissance produced Shakespeare's tragic heroine, the modern age created the glamorous Hollywood superstar, the topic of academic arguments, and even the inspiration for some bold fashion choices. It is amazing that a woman who has been gone for more than 2,000 years can still spark such lively conversations and debates at university conferences and coffee shops alike. The invention of movies brought Cleopatra to life for a global audience, locking in her image as a figure of magnetic power and stunning beauty. The biggest example is undoubtedly the 1963 epic Cleopatra asterisk, featuring the legendary Elizabeth Taylor in the lead role with Richard Burton as Marc Antony. That movie, famous for its insane budget, it was the highest-grossing film of its year, but still almost bankrupted 20th Century Fox. Along with its lavish costumes and sets, defined Taylor as the ultimate Cleopatra for an entire generation. Her specific look, featuring elaborate wigs, flowing gowns, and heavy eyeliner, became synonymous with the Queen, frequently overshadowing the actual historical details of her rule. The real-life romance between Burton and Taylor, which caught fire on set, just added another layer of scandalous excitement to the Cleopatra legend. While historians still debate how accurate the film was, nobody can deny its cultural impact. It certainly wasn't a documentary, but it was undeniably entertaining. Away from the movie cameras, Cleopatra has remained a rich topic for scholars and historians. Modern research has largely moved past the sensational Roman narratives, trying to peel away the propaganda to find the real person underneath. This involves a careful analysis of coins, archaeological finds, and ancient texts to reconstruct her reign and life with better accuracy. Current research tends to highlight her political skills, her multilingualism, and her intellect, rather than focusing solely on her love life. Experts now see her as a highly capable leader who managed a dangerous political world with skill, making practical choices to keep her kingdom alive. She was a sharp politician, not just a seductress. Despite all this academic work, the public image of Cleopatra stays stubbornly planted in the romantic, exoticized versions of the past. She still inspires pop culture in a million ways, showing up in video games, comic books, novels, and as a constant reference in the beauty and fashion worlds. Her signature look, especially that famous eye makeup, keeps getting reinvented, which just goes to show that some trends are truly timeless. You can still spot traces of her style in today's makeup aisles, confirming her status as a genuine trendsetter. That said, modern takes on Cleopatra also reflect current conversations about historical representation, Orientalism, and female power. There is a constant debate about how to depict her without falling into old stereotypes or supporting colonial viewpoints. Is she an icon of female empowerment who stood up to the patriarchal Roman system? Or do some portrayals still accidentally reinforce the idea of the exotic other? These complex questions keep the discussions going in both popular culture and academia. One of the most interesting parts of her lasting presence is the ongoing argument among scholars regarding what she actually looked like. Despite all the paintings and movies, we don't have a single, universally accepted portrait from her lifetime. Coins from her era offer some hints, usually showing a woman with a strong chin, a prominent nose, and a stern look, which is pretty different from the delicate beauty usually seen in Hollywood. Historians continue to argue over whether those coin portraits were realistic or stylized. This uncertainty just adds to the mystery, letting every generation imagine their own ideal version of her. It is essentially a historical Rorschach test where everyone sees a different queen. Basically, Cleopatra has become a canvas where different eras paint their own anxieties and fascinations. She represents the drama of Roman politics, the allure of ancient Egypt, and the timeless messiness of ambition and love. Her story gets reimagined, retold, and reinterpreted because it hits on universal themes: betrayal, seduction, power, and the desperate struggle to survive. She remains, gloriously and sometimes controversially, one of history's most captivating puzzles, a queen whose legend lives and breathes long after she turned to dust. As we look deeper into this enduring myth, we need to circle back to the geographical center of the story, Egypt itself. Following her death, the land of the pharaohs went through its biggest change in thousands of years, shifting from an independent kingdom, even if it was influenced by Rome, to a direct province of the growing Roman Empire. This wasn't just a swap of leaders. It was a total reset of Egypt's cultural, economic, and political identity. Picture the vibrant, messy court life of the Ptolemies being replaced by the slow, grinding gears of imperial bureaucracy. Octavian, now the undisputed ruler of the Roman world, grasped just how important Egypt was. He didn't treat it like a normal province run by the Senate. He treated it as his personal property. He put a prefect in charge, someone from the equestrian class, which was below the rank of senator, who answered only to him. This very specific setup was designed to stop any ambitious Roman senator from using Egypt's grain and wealth as a launchpad for their own power, which is exactly what Antony had tried to do. It was a strategic play that concentrated massive economic power right in Octavian's hands, cementing his future authority as emperor. Effectively, he put a velvet rope around the entire country and declared it VIP access only for himself. The most immediate effect on Egypt was economic. The huge profits from its fertile fields, especially the yearly grain harvest, were now funneled straight to Rome. This grain was essential for feeding the people of Rome, making it a pillar of Octavian's public support and a symbol of his ability to provide. Egypt turned into Rome's personal breadbasket, preventing food riots in the capital and ensuring stability. While this did bring some infrastructure improvements and Roman order, it also meant Egypt's wealth was being drained to benefit Rome rather than to develop its own people or culture. Historians still debate whether Roman rule brought stability and prosperity to the average Egyptian farmer, or if it just traded one foreign ruler for another. The reality is likely complicated. Culturally, Roman rule introduced a slow blend of Hellenistic and Roman influences, while the Romans generally respected local religious traditions, even adopting Egyptian gods like Isis. The dominant culture shifted. Greek stayed the language of scholarship and administration in Alexandria, but Latin became more prominent in official business. Roman architecture started influencing local buildings, and Roman law began to overlay Egyptian customs. However, ancient Egyptian traditions, especially in art and religion, were incredibly resilient. Temples were still constructed in the classic Egyptian style, and worship of local gods continued, often right alongside the new Roman cults. It was a fascinating cultural mix, sometimes clashing and sometimes harmonious, like a Roman gladiator showing up at a pharaoh's banquet. The Roman takeover also meant a heavy military occupation. Legions were permanently stationed there to guard the grain supply and deter any threats from the east or south. This military presence kept the peace, but it also served as a constant reminder of foreign control. Egypt was no longer a kingdom of pharaohs, but a vital gear in the massive Roman imperial machine. For the average Egyptian, the end of the Ptolemies and the arrival of Rome probably brought a mix of change and continuity. The bureaucracy kept running, just with Roman oversight, and the tax system stayed mostly the same, though the money went to Rome. For the fellahin working the fields, daily life dictated by the Nile probably didn't change as much as it did for the elites. Still, the feeling of a sovereign, independent Egypt ruled by its own monarchs faded away, replaced by the heavy hand of Rome. Although it was no longer the capital of an independent state, the great city of Alexandria remained a bustling hub of intellect and trade under Roman rule. Its port continued to be a critical gateway for goods moving between west and east. The Library of Alexandria, while past its absolute peak, still held massive collections of scrolls and drew in scholars, though its status as the world's top research center slowly declined as other Roman cities grew more intellectual. It was like a star that had once shone the brightest, but was now just part of a larger constellation. Ultimately, the annexation of Egypt under Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus, was a strategic masterstroke that solidified the foundations of the Roman Empire. It effectively poured the concrete for a stable, wealthy, and resource-rich regime, allowing Rome to evolve from a chaotic republic into a seemingly imperishable empire. However, this shift also signaled the final curtain call for a remarkable era, concluding the story of a distinct, ancient civilization governed by its own monarchs. Cleopatra, the final descendant of her dynasty, acts as the bold exclamation point closing this lengthy sentence of Egyptian history, representing a queen whose personal destiny was entirely intertwined with the fate of her nation. Having followed Cleopatra's narrative from her origins in Alexander's legacy to the definitive Roman takeover of Egypt, it becomes evident that her biological existence, while gripping, is merely one fraction of her lasting impact. Arguably, her most potent legacy isn't found in the dusty facts of history books, but within the colorful, shifting fabric of her legend. It is truly mind-boggling that a person who lived over 2,000 years ago can still ignite arguments, fuel artistic masterpieces, and make headlines today. Just picture trying to explain to the real Cleopatra that, centuries later, strangers would be bickering about the shape of her nose on tiny screens held in their hands. At the heart of the Cleopatra legend lies a volatile mixture of tragedy, beauty, and authority, frequently spiked with heavy doses of romance and exoticism. For ages, she has held the title of the ultimate femme fatale, the irresistible siren capable of twisting powerful Roman generals around her finger. As we noted earlier, this image was meticulously manufactured by Octavian's propaganda machine, which needed to frame Antony's behavior not as political ambition, but as a disgraceful surrender to foreign, feminine corruption. Even though this narrative unfairly dismisses the real Cleopatra's political sharp-wittedness, it stuck like glue. It became the standard lens through which the West viewed her. Scholars continue to debate the true roots of this deadly woman archetype and how much Cleopatra herself influenced its creation. Literature, as we've mentioned, was key in hardening this myth. In 1607, Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra turned her into a figure of poetic majesty and deep psychology. His version of the queen is volatile and passionate, a self-determined heroine who chooses death over shame, yet she remains defined by her romantic entanglements. The massive success of this play cemented her tale, specifically the romance with Antony, into the bedrock of Western culture, influencing how countless generations visualized the queen. When you recall the dramatic goodbyes and famous quotes, you're often remembering Shakespeare's brilliant script, not necessarily exact history. Following the Bard, writers ranging from Dryden to Shaw kept remixing her story, adding fresh coats of paint to the legend. Her appeal spanned eras because she embodied timeless struggles, the collision of East and West, the corruption of ambition, the intoxicating power of love, and fate's inevitability. She served as a blank canvas for exploring exotic fantasies, illicit desires, and the high cost of political gambling. Painters and sculptors also latched onto Cleopatra's dramatic life. Whether it was neoclassical pieces showing seductive meetings with Caesar and Antony, or lush Victorian paintings of her suicide and luxury, artists drained the story for inspiration. These visuals usually highlighted her theatrical outfits, beauty, and the sensual mystery of ancient Egypt, locking in her status as an exotic enchantress. The more exaggerated, the better. You can practically imagine the artists whispering, "Throw in more gold leaf, and maybe another exotic bird." Even scientific fields like Egyptology and archaeology, while striving for accuracy, accidentally boosted her mystique. The discovery of tombs and artifacts in the 19th and early 20th centuries kicked off a popular craze for all things Egyptian, placing Cleopatra, as the last independent ruler, at the center of this Egyptomania. The mummies, massive architecture, and hieroglyphs provided a cinematic setting that made her dramatic life feel even more vivid. It gave a sense of ancient reality to a woman who was becoming more myth than human. Yet, underneath all this artistic romanticization, we must not forget the actual person. This was a woman who ran a massive empire, spoke 9 languages fluently, and navigated the cutthroat waters of Roman politics. The legend frequently eclipses the brilliance of the actual statesman, shrinking her down to a tragic girlfriend instead of a powerhouse monarch. Historians still struggle to present a fair picture that respects the fascinating myth while highlighting the complex historical reality. The beauty, and indeed the challenge, of Cleopatra's enduring legend is its flexibility. She has morphed from a Roman nightmare to a Shakespearean lead, a Hollywood icon, and a symbol of female defiance. Every version mirrors the obsessions and values of that specific time, demonstrating that some tales are simply too gripping and universal to ever fade away. Her legend ensures she will continue to baffle and beguile us for ages, whispering stories of epic love and ancient power into the dark. As we travel through the layers of Cleopatra's myth, it is intriguing to realize how much of our perception relies on narratives created by others rather than direct evidence. This is especially true when looking at the political and cultural lens used to view her, both during her life and throughout history. The very concept of an Eastern queen, holding such sway over Roman matters, deeply disturbed the militaristic, male-dominated Roman Republic, triggering a calculated smear campaign well before she died. Octavian, a genius at propaganda, knew the only way to beat Antony was to destroy his reputation first. The simplest method was painting him as a puppet entirely under the influence of a decadent, foreign queen. Cleopatra served as the perfect scapegoat, representing everything Rome feared about the East, its luxury, its perceived effeminacy, and its monarchical traditions that opposed Roman republican ideals. Roman poets and historians, desperate to please the rising power of Octavian, fell in line. They depicted her as a cunning temptress, a sorceress, or a whore queen who used beauty and tricks to trap great Roman men and destroy the Republic. This wasn't merely reporting, it was a weaponized narrative used with devastating precision. Historians still debate if this propaganda reflected actual public opinion or if it was a top-down fabrication to excuse Octavian's war. Likely, it was a mix of both, considering how easily fear and prejudice can be ignited. This smear was so effective that it defined Cleopatra's image for centuries. It explains why the term femme fatale is still so readily associated with her today. Her multilingualism, intellect, and political skill were twisted into traits of deceit and manipulation. Her wealth became a sign of decadence, and her charm became a tool of corruption. It was a textbook example of reducing a powerful woman to her sexual influence, a trope that unfortunately still resonates in some modern discussions. However, a careful look at the historical record reveals a much more pragmatic and complex individual. First and foremost, Cleopatra was a ruler. Her main objective was saving her dynasty and kingdom. While her bonds with Caesar and Antony were personal, they were also shrewd political alliances. She knew wealthy Egypt couldn't fight the might of Rome alone. She required powerful Roman protectors, so she selected the most powerful men of her era. Her ability to command respect and devotion from such ruthless figures proves her charisma and intellect went far beyond physical looks. Trying to charm two dominant world leaders into backing your cause takes much more than a pretty face. Furthermore, Cleopatra was deeply immersed in her Egyptian identity, despite being ethnically Macedonian Greek. She learned the Egyptian language, performed the rituals, and styled herself as a living goddess linked to Isis, the deity of magic and motherhood. This was a strategic move to validate her rule to her Egyptian subjects, many of whom were tired of foreign Ptolemaic rulers. This cultural adaptability was a mark of sophistication, yet Roman propaganda dismissed it as Oriental corruption and proof she had abandoned proper values. The gap between the historical Cleopatra and her mythical portrayal emphasizes the power of storytelling. The Roman version successfully stripped her of agency as a ruler, focusing instead on her perceived vice. It simplified a strategic defense into a woman's whims and a political alliance into a scandalous romance. This simplification, while effective for propaganda, has distorted our understanding of one of history's most formidable women. It is a sobering realization that historians still debate whether a powerful female figure could have ever escaped being demonized by Roman patriarchal society. Ultimately, grasping the real Cleopatra means intentionally separating the layers of myth from the threads of history. We must see her not just as the star of a grand tragedy, but as a brilliant, determined queen fighting to save her ancient kingdom in a world being reshaped by Rome's unstoppable power. Her story proves the enduring impact of a charismatic personality, even when her legacy was meticulously and unfairly rewritten by the victors. As we continue to dissect the many faces of Cleopatra, from historical queen to mythical enchantress, it is worth pausing to consider the sheer volume of misinformation and fantasy attached to her name. For many, she remains the figure from Hollywood romances or dramatic literature, often at the expense of her true character as a shrewd, multilingual, and politically astute ruler. This distortion isn't just an academic annoyance, it shapes how we understand powerful women in history. It's like trying to understand a complex recipe but only focusing on the garnish. One of the most enduring myths is that her power came solely from overwhelming beauty and sexual allure. While ancient sources attest to her charm, they rarely emphasize physical beauty the way modern media does. Plutarch, a detailed ancient biographer, explicitly states that her beauty, as we are told, was not in itself altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her. Instead, he highlights her irresistible charm, persuasive speech, and force of character as the things that made her captivating. This suggests her intellect and wit were far more potent than mere looks. Imagine a powerful woman who didn't rely on Instagram filters. This subtle distinction is often lost in popular narratives that prefer the simpler, spicy story of a femme fatale. Historians still argue about how much of this description was a deliberate counter-narrative to Roman propaganda versus genuine observation. Another persistent misconception is viewing her simply as a lover of Caesar and Antony, rather than a political equal or strategic partner. This reduces her agency and diminishes her profound role in the late Roman Republic's events. Her relationships with these powerful figures were essential political maneuvers. These connections with Roman commanders went far beyond personal feelings. They were intricate parts of a geopolitical game plan designed to save the Ptolemaic line and keep Egypt safe in a volatile era. She didn't just fall for these men. She forged partnerships necessary for her very existence. By leveraging her wealth, charisma, and unique status, she managed to navigate a landscape dominated by Roman strength, keeping Egypt nominally free for as long as she could. Think about the idea that she wanted to rule as Empress of Rome. Although Roman propaganda pushed this story to make her look like a villain, it is very doubtful that she or Antony actually planned to move the capital to Alexandria or turn Rome into a subordinate province. Roman culture was intensely hateful toward monarchs and foreigners, meaning any such bold attempt would have sparked an immediate and violent revolt. Her goals were probably much more practical, building a strong, standalone Hellenistic realm that could exist alongside Rome, potentially as a major Eastern power. She envisioned a revitalized Hellenistic empire, not to conquer Rome, but to act as a counterweight to it. We also need to address the romanticized idea that she was purely Egyptian. Even though she followed local customs, spoke the language, and posed as a living goddess, she was ethnically Macedonian Greek, tracing her line back to Ptolemy Isoter, a general of Alexander the Great. Her mother tongue was Koine Greek, the common language of that era. Grasping this mix of Greek and Egyptian traits is key to understanding her, as it mirrors the fusion within the Ptolemaic dynasty itself. Labeling her simply Egyptian overlooks a huge chunk of her ancestry and the complicated cultural mix of her reign. It is similar to calling a New Yorker strictly American, while ignoring their diverse immigrant family history. Our obsession with her often misses the heavy economic and strategic facts of that period. Egypt wasn't merely a pretty setting for romance. It was a geopolitical jackpot, an incredibly rich country providing the grain needed to feed Rome's people. Her conflicts and partnerships weren't just soap operas. They were dangerous maneuvers involving massive resources and control over the region. With such high stakes, her decisions affected entire continents. When we look past the myths, we find a greater respect for the real Cleopatra, a tough leader who fought hard to keep her throne and her nation's freedom against the overwhelming force of Rome. She was a woman of vast intellect, drive, and toughness who stood up to the strongest men of her time. Her life is more than a sad love story. It stands as proof of amazing leadership, reminding us that history is usually more complicated and fascinating than the easy stories we tend to like. We have walked through her victories and failures, sailed the dangerous seas of Roman politics, and stripped away the legends surrounding her. Now, let's take a final moment to think about the woman herself, the lasting results of her actions, and the huge mark she left on antiquity and our own minds. Picture the wind blowing over Egypt's sands, carrying her tale across centuries, sometimes clearly and other times twisted by time. Cleopatra was, without a doubt, a force of nature. She was born into a failing family line, inheriting a kingdom full of debt and family plotting rather than stability. However, against the odds, she not only took back her crown several times, but also kept Egypt independent for almost 20 years while the Roman Republic kept expanding. That success wasn't just good fortune. It proved her sharp mind, diplomatic skill, and iron will. Historians still debate if she just delayed the inevitable or if she actually had a shot at building a permanent empire in the East. Maybe she did, had luck been on her side or had Roman greed been less intense. Her main asset was her flexibility and talent for connecting with different groups. She wasn't only a Greek monarch, she was a pharaoh who adopted Egyptian ways, spoke the tongue, and acted as a living god. This gained her the people's loyalty in ways her ancestors never achieved. Then there was her unique talent for charming the era's most powerful figures, Julius Caesar and Marc Antony. As we noted, this went beyond looks. It was about matching them intellectually and strategically, making herself crucial to their goals. She was an expert at ruling, managing high-level international diplomacy with a skill rarely found in any time period, especially in a young woman of the ancient world. You could call her a multilingual politician with a gift for acquiring strong allies. Still, her tale is deeply tragic. Despite her brilliance and grit, she couldn't stop the steady advance of Rome. She bet everything on her bonds with Antony and Caesar, linking her future to theirs. When an assassin killed Caesar, and Octavian's cold tactics defeated Antony, Cleopatra's universe, and Egypt's freedom collapsed. Her last act of taking her own life, meant to deny Octavian his total victory, solidified her legacy as a proud, unbeaten queen, but it also closed a glorious, ancient chapter of Egyptian history. It serves as a harsh reminder that even the strongest people can be crushed by broader historical shifts. Her offspring, trapped in the wreckage of their parents' decisions, suffered the consequences of Roman pragmatism. Caesarion, known as Little Caesar, was killed to remove any threat to Caesar's name. Her children with Antony were spared execution, but served as props for Roman victory, marched through the city streets before vanishing into the Roman aristocracy. Their lives illustrated the brutal cost of conquest and the absolute nature of Rome's win. Consequently, Cleopatra's legacy is a complex tapestry woven from facts, propaganda, and art. She remains fascinating because she represents so many timeless contrasts: strength and weakness, romance and drive, east and west, resistance and loss. She forces us to ignore simple stories and value the complex reality of the human experience and the forces that mold history. Her legend changes with every generation, speaking to our own interests in powerful women, illicit love, and the mystery of the ancients. Whether viewed as a doomed lover, a shrewd politician, or an icon of female power, Cleopatra holds our focus, proving she lived a life of epic proportions. As our historical journey concludes and night falls, think of Cleopatra not merely as a monarch, but as a woman who dreamed of empire despite the odds, whose intelligence burned bright, and whose tale whispers through the eras. Thus, the grand story of the final pharaoh gently comes to rest. Let the heaviness of history surround you like ancient sands covering lost monuments. Her narrative is like a river traversing time, taking us through palaces and battles, through rumors of romance and cries of treachery, creating ripples that last for thousands of years. Picture the faint light of the lighthouse at Alexandria, now just a memory signaling ships to a harbor that once bustled with her life. Her voice, once speaking many languages, now merges with the quiet background of the universe. The sounds of her orders, her laughter, and her last breath fade into the calm silence of the past. Let the intriguing mystery of this queen, who challenged history's tide, find a place in your thoughts. Her ambitions, her fights, and her remarkable life are now woven into the comforting fabric of time itself. The story is complete, leaving behind the piece that follows the greatest of tales.